Imagine working full-time, doing everything right, earning more than your parents ever did, and still realizing you may never own a home. Imagine scrolling through listings where the cheapest home looks like a set from a crime documentary. Still, it's at somehow hopelessly over your budget. And imagine being told again and again that if you just saved harder, stopped buying coffee, and weren't patient, you'd eventually get there. But the numbers tell a very different story. House prices in Australia have tripled since 1990, while wages have crawled up just 50%. And if trends don't change, it could take another 70 years, almost an entire lifetime, just to return to the affordability levels your parents enjoyed in the year 2000. So the question we need to ask is simple. How do you buy a home in a system that no longer wants you? Today, we're asking the question almost every young and middle-class Australian now whispers under their breath. Why does owning a home feel impossible unless you're already rich, born into wealth, or waiting on an inheritance? For decades, Australians were told the simple story: work hard, save responsibly, and eventually you'll buy a home. But today, that story doesn't match the maths. In fact, the numbers tell a much darker truth, one that most people don't want to hear. Let's start with the headline figure that explains almost everything. The median capital city house price is now 12.8 times the average Australian income. To put that back in perspective, rewind to the year 2000. Back then, the ratio was 6.5 times income. Affordability has completely broken. The housing market didn't just drift upward, it disconnected from the reality of Australian wages. And it gets worse. Economists often talk about long-term rebalancing, the idea that wages will eventually catch up. So researchers modeled a hypothetical. What if house prices only rise at 2.5% a year, the Reserve Bank's inflation target, and wages grow at 3.5%? Surely that would help, right? Well, no. Even in that optimistic scenario, one that Australia has not consistently achieved in decades, it would take 70 years just to return to the affordability levels of the early 2000s. 70 years. That means somebody born today might see affordability return around about the time they retire. And while those long-term numbers are shocking, the short-term realities are even more brutal. Because right now, even Australians earning six-figure salaries, incomes that once guaranteed a comfortable middle-class life, are failing basic lending tests in many suburbs. Think about that. You can earn $100,000 a year, do all the right things, manage your budget, avoid debt, and still be told, no, you can't afford a home near where you work. For young Australians, the situation feels even more hopeless. Many estimate they need 20 to 27 years just to save a deposit. Not to buy the house, just to be able to sign onto a long-term mortgage that will allow ownership decades later. If you're 25 today, that means you might finally scrape together a deposit in your mid-40s, assuming prices don't rise faster than your savings. And in Australia, they always have. It's no wonder that when researchers surveyed Australians, 35% said they believe they'll never own a home in their own lifetime. And that's the real emotional cost of this crisis. It's not just about numbers on a chart. It's about belief. The belief that if you work hard, you can get ahead. The belief that homeownership is achievable. That belief is fading quickly. And for millions of Australians, it's already gone. Of course, Australia's housing crisis didn't appear out of thin air. It was built, or rather, not built, over decades. At its core is a simple truth. We don't construct enough homes, and we haven't for years. Every economist in the country keeps repeating the same blunt messages: build, baby, build. And here's the twist. Australia can't build enough, even when it wants to. Let's start with zoning. Imagine a map of a city divided into tiny boxes, each one wrapped in red tape. Zoning determines what can be built where. And in Australia, it often says, not here. Large sections of our biggest cities are locked behind restrictive rules that only allow low-density housing. Next, planning delays. Anyone who has ever tried to renovate a house knows how slow the process can be. Now imagine that delay multiplied by thousands of homes, thousands of approvals across every council in the country. Then of course there are NIMBY resistance. Not in my backyard. Whenever someone proposes new apartments, higher density or a subdivision, local groups push back. They fear traffic, noise, shadows, and anything that disrupts the status quo. The result, precious years lost in objections, revisions, and hearings. Even when we do approve projects, there's another trap. Infrastructure that hasn't kept up. You can't just drop 20,000 new homes in a suburb with one road, no rail, and a school with 12 parking spots. For decades, the population has grown faster than the infrastructure that supports it. This mismatch killed new development before it even begins. And now, a newer crisis: construction insolvencies. Builders are collapsing at record rates because material costs have exploded. Contracts on construction were fixed and margins have vanished. Hundreds of approved developments were suddenly frozen because the builder simply stopped answering the phone. All these pressures combined into one brutal reality. Australia is a low-build, high-price economy. We create less new housing per capita than many similar nations, and we pay more for it. If you want to see what successful reform looks like, look across the Tasman Sea. Auckland rezoned major parts of the city, unlocking more medium-density housing. The result? A surge of supply and a moderation of price growth. Meanwhile, Australia keeps announcing ambitious national housing targets. But the sad truth is that approvals are collapsing, not rising. Councils are rejecting more proposals, builders are walking away, and timelines are blowing out. This is the engine of the crisis: chronic undersupply. When demand runs ahead of supply for long enough, prices can only go one direction: up. And the people who benefit most from that upward pressure, well, that takes us to the next chapter. The whole story about owning a house collapses the moment you look at how the system actually works. Because in modern Australia, first-time home buyers aren't competing in a fair race at all. At the centre of this imbalance are two policy settings that quietly reshape the entire market: negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. These rules don't reward families looking for a place to live. They reward investors looking for a tax strategy. Negative gearing allows investors to use their losses to reduce their taxable income. Imagine buying a property when the rent doesn't cover the mortgage, and instead of that being a problem, it becomes a tax advantage. It's like the system whispers, "Don't worry if it's losing money now. The tax office will take the blow." Then comes the capital gains tax discount. Pay tax on only half the profit when you eventually sell. Put those two together and you get a powerful message from the tax code. Buy as many properties as you can, the system has your back. Now compare that to a young couple trying to buy their first home. No tax offsets, no deductible losses, no ability to leverage a property portfolio, just ordinary wages, a rising cost of living, and the desperate attempt to scrape together a deposit. It's no surprise that since the year 2000, home ownership rates have dropped from around 70% to the low 60s. So where did that missing 10% go? Well, it didn't vanish, it just transformed into investment properties. Properties that once would have gone to young families are now sitting inside investor portfolios, often bought with borrowed money and protected by tax benefits. This gives investors three huge advantages. First, they can borrow more. Banks love investors with multiple incomes and equity to leverage. Second, they can absorb losses. A young family can't afford negative cash flow. An investor shrugs it off. The tax deduction softens it. Then they can outbid younger buyers. Imagine showing up at an auction with your life savings next to someone who already owns 4 properties and is borrowing against them.
The shift has quietly created a 3-tier class structure in Australia. At the bottom sits the renting class, a group that lives in constant motion, moving from lease to lease, coping with inspections, rental hikes, and insecurity. Picture a young couple walking through yet another rental inspection, knowing they might have to do the same thing again in 6 months. Then comes the homeowner class, the group that made it in, but only just. They're stable, but stretched thin. Their home brings security, but also pressure. 30-year mortgages, rising repayments, and very little financial breathing room. And above both sits the landlord class, the group whose wealth grows fastest. But even that isn't the biggest shift happening in Australia, because now for millions of young people, owning a home depends on something far more uncomfortable than their income. More and more young Australians quietly admit something they never thought they'd say out loud. The only way I'll ever buy a home is when my parents die. It sounds harsh, almost shocking, but it's become a statistical reality. Australia is entering the largest wealth transfer in its history, with around $3.5 trillion expected to shift from older generations to younger ones over the next 20 years. On average, each inheritance will be roughly $320,000, a life-altering amount in a housing market where deposits alone can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But inheriting money isn't a plan, it's luck. And relying on it creates a strange emotional tension that previous generations never had to carry. Some young people feel relieved, knowing help will come eventually. Others feel anxious, guilty, or even resentful. Imagine looking at your parents and knowing the only path to stability is tied to their absence. It twists something deep inside you. And it doesn't end there. Families argue about it. Siblings fight over expectations. Partners compare backgrounds. Inheritance, once a quiet afterthought, is now a central financial strategy. And it's destabilizing relationships as much as it's reshaping the housing market. But the sharpest divide is between those who expect to inherit and those who know they never will. For the second group, the system feels locked. When someone works hard, saves for years, and still watches prices run faster than their income, the frustration becomes existential. You hear voices saying, "What's the point? I can't save faster. I'll die renting." And the numbers back that feeling. As inheritances grow, so does the gap between those with a family safety net and those without. Housing is no longer about your job, your discipline, or your ambition. It's about your parents' bank account. And for the first time in modern Australian history, we are drifting towards something we swore we'd never become. A hereditary class system where your birth, not your effort, decides your future. And that raises an even bigger question. Because if inheritance is now the gatekeeper, what happens to the famous Australian fair go? Let's see how rising inequality has quietly killed the idea that everyone gets a fair chance. Australia likes to imagine itself as an egalitarian country, a place where hard work matters more than background and where everyone starts from roughly the same line. But if you look at the last 40 years of economic data, the picture is unmistakably different. Inequality in wealth, in income, and even in consumption has been rising steadily for decades. A big part of that story is wages. The share of national income going to workers is now at a 60-year low. Think about that for a second. For 6 decades, Australia's workers have never received a smaller slice of the country's economic pie than they do today. When wages fall behind and prices leap ahead, the gap between people widens. And the wider that gap gets, the more it locks people into a situation they're born into. Australians often believe we have high social mobility, that moving up is normal, and that family background matters less here than in other countries, but the data says the opposite. Economists measure this using something called intergenerational income elasticity. To calculate this figure, you run a regression on the logarithm of the younger generation's income. Never mind, you don't need to know the formula. All you need to know is this: the number ranges from 0 to 1. 0 would mean your parents' income has no influence on your life outcomes. 1 would mean your income is basically a copy of your parents'. Australia's score is 0.35. That's lower mobility than most people assume, and closer to the UK and US than to the Nordic nations we like to compare ourselves to. In simple terms, it means that if you're born at the bottom, you're more likely to stay there, no matter how hard you work. But if you dig deeper, you'll find that inequality shows up geographically. Where you live now predicts your income, your health, your education, and even your life expectancy. Inner city areas where house prices are astronomical aren't just wealthy, they come with networks, better schools, better hospitals, shorter commutes, and stronger job markets. Living there amplifies opportunity. Outer suburbs, on the other hand, have weaker public transport, fewer job opportunities, lower quality services, and higher levels of disadvantage. These places have become Australia's postcodes of destiny, where your future narrows the further you are from the CBD. Your postcode is becoming a prediction. Combine this with the housing market and you get something even more worrying. The 3 housing classes, renter, homeowner, and landlord, has started morphing into 3 social classes. Renters are stuck paying high prices for low security, homeowners are stable but stretched, landlords are compounding wealth through the system itself. For a country that defined itself by fairness, this is a seismic shift. The fair go was a belief that effort mattered, but today, inequality determines who gets the chance to try. And all of this leads to one final uncomfortable truth. The modern economy itself no longer supports the traditional idea of owning a home through hard work. It's not that young people have changed, it's that the economy has. The world that made traditional homeownership possible simply doesn't exist anymore. Nearly half of all Australians, or 49% to be exact, now live paycheck to paycheck. That means every unexpected bill, every medical expense, every car repair becomes a mini crisis. And when you add job insecurity into the mix, the picture becomes even tougher. Around 12% of workers say they feel insecure in their current job. Not unsure about promotion or unsure about the next role, but unsure whether the job will even exist next month. The rise of the gig economy and contract work has pulled the ground out from underneath traditional financial models that banks still expect. Flexible work might sound modern and exciting, but for most people it means one thing: unstable income. One month is busy, the next is slow. Some weeks are great, some weeks are quiet. But mortgages, they don't understand quiet weeks. They demand something completely different. They demand stability, the kind of stability that used to come from long-term employment and predictable wages. They expect a perfect savings record, consistent deposits into your account, and the ability to commit your repayments for the next 25 to 30 years without a single wobble. And this is where the old model starts to break, because the modern Australian worker doesn't have 30 years certainty. They barely have 30 weeks certainty. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked to leap into a commitment longer than most marriages while your job contract lasts 6 months. That's the reality today. Even for those who manage to buy early, the picture isn't as rosy as it once was. Researchers show that early homeowners, especially younger ones, often experience declining financial well-being compared to renters. That sounds strange, right? Owning is supposed to be the dream. But think about what happens after the purchase. The mortgage comes like clockwork. Then comes the maintenance cost, the leaking roof, the broken hot water system, the repairs that nobody warned you would cost thousands. Suddenly, owning isn't freedom. It's a new kind of money trap, right? In the industry, some call this mortgage prison. To put it simply, the modern economy is completely out of sync with the old-school idea of home ownership that requires stability, predictability, and decades-long financial confidence. In the end, the question isn't just whether you can own a home in Australia, it's whether the dream still makes sense in the world we live. More and more young Australians are looking at the numbers, looking at the stress, looking at the 30-year commitment, and quietly saying, why would I sign a lifetime contract? For many, freedom now matters more than a mortgage. Travel, flexibility, experiences, mental health, these things feel real, reachable, and meaningful in a way a $1 million loan simply doesn't. But step back for a moment. If an entire generation is walking away from home ownership, is it really a personal choice? Or is it a signal that the system no longer works? Because right now, you don't buy a home through effort. You buy it through advantage. You buy it by being rich or having parents who are rich, or by waiting for an inheritance you don't want to think about. Everyone else, they're renting, they're squeezed, and they're watching the ladder get pulled up one rung at a time. So the real question becomes, what happens to a society with a basic foundation of stability? A home is only available to those born into the right family. And if nothing changes, what kind of Australia are we building for the next generation?